Death Stranding is a curious beast, a game that strips concepts to their simplest yet often feels bloated, an experience with a simple conceit that is unnecessarily convoluted. It's a game that can easily feel quite satisfying to indulge, partaking in simple, repetitive yet rewarding tasks, while also feeling like you're not actually achieving anything. To say I was feeling reluctant going into Death Stranding is something of an understatement. While I'm happy to go in with an open mind and try it out, I have also become increasingly resistant to the works of Hideo Kojima and his particular style of exuberant, often ridiculous modes of storytelling, often establishing unnecessarily complex world building that is delivered via flashy cinematics, now with the benefits of motion capture and celebrity cameos. I say all this up front given Death Stranding is probably my favourite game of Kojima's since maybe the first or second Metal Gear Solid. The game takes place in a post-apocalyptic United States that through the magic of video games looks a lot like Iceland. As you take charge of Sam Bridges, your job is to deliver packages between way stations scattered across the country, all the while avoiding the likes of human scavengers seeking to steal the items in your charge, alongside avoiding ethereal and monstrous forces that now occupy the new world. The whole game builds from a high concept of the Death Stranding, and the notion of beached things or BTs, creatures from the other side, after we all die, that have somehow made their way into our world, as the barrier between them has been weakened courtesy of the Death Stranding. The near future timeline allows for much of the high fiction to play out in a way that's quite intriguing and entertaining. Don't get me wrong, a lot of it is still utter nonsense and slightly creepy in a rather juvenile way, as is most of Kojima's work, but I found it much easier to get on board with this time around. As described, the core conceit of the game is navigating between locations. The real challenge comes from being able to carry the items you have in a way that retains their quality and structural integrity, while also not exhausting Sam too much in the process. The game really takes time to look at the idea of basic movement, of trying to get from one place to another, and what challenges you can face in accomplishing that. Be it keeping your balance, navigating a difficult segment of terrain, managing your stamina and health, and keeping all your goods safely stowed on your back. While on paper this sounds like it could be quite frustrating, the controls combined with the overall aesthetic deliver a rather peaceful experience. Taking 20 minutes to walk from one location to another while carrying a few items is often quite rewarding, and dare I say it, even relaxing. Even over time you begin to become accustomed to the threat the BTs present, and while you can never really take it for granted, the anxiety or panic that a BT field induces is much reduced. I think much of this really stems from the overall aesthetic that the game creates. There is a sense of calm for the most part, and wonder in navigating the open world. The visuals are breathtaking, as the environment art team have taken the Icelandic terrain for inspiration and reproduced it in a manner that feels quite immense. The one disappointment is, with the exception of the human bandits and the BTs, there's no other life in any of these open worlds. Sure, to some extent there is a narrative framing for a lot of this, but it robs the game of some beauty and serenity it presents by having no ambient life in any of the world that you travel through. I can totally appreciate that for some people, a game predicated on fetch quests could seem incredibly dull, but there is something of a tranquility in the ability to participate in otherwise boring activities and watch the connections you build with different characters and outposts increase. The lizard portion of my brain seems to enjoy this quite a bit. The game really seems to lean into this, particularly with progression leading to the likes of new equipment, such as ladders, ropes, skeletal frames that will allow you to carry more or run faster, and even the unlocking of hover carts, bikes, and trucks to help speed up the process. Not to mention allow you to tackle the more demanding tasks, as certain factions request that you carry vast quantities of materials across the new world. This ties into the other major thematic component of the game. While you're rebuilding connections between these factions and non-player characters in the service of the fiction, it opens up an online connection to other players. As you move around the world, you might leave ladders to climb up some geological feature, or a rope to climb down rocky terrain. However, as the strength of the chiral network has increased, the items you've left will be available for other players to use. Similarly, you begin to see items that other players have left in the world, with the option to leave likes for their activities in an almost Dark Souls-esque fashion. This then also opens up greater collaboration, as structures such as recharge stations, radar towers, and even roads can be created by dropping construction units down in the world. However, the resource budget for these items is often beyond your own capabilities, hence any player can contribute to a construction project that is visible in their game, and in turn it helps make your lives all a little bit easier in the process. Now this all might sound like the game is bereft of combat, and quite often that is far from the case, But I'd argue for much of your time playing the game, that's not the primary focus. You can fight off mules and other humans who come into contact with you when out in the world, but it takes a long time for you to earn any fatal equipment, given the emphasis is often on knocking them out to make an escape. In fact, as you discover later, with human characters it's best not to kill them, given this means you have to dispose of the body, otherwise it could lead to a terminal state of the game, again tying into the narrative. Meanwhile, you gradually equip a larger and more meaningful arsenal for taking on BTs, including the larger and more ferocious ones, but the combat often feels like a bit of an afterthought. It's in there, but it seldom melds with the rest of the game's mechanics and established elements. It often feels like equipping and wielding larger and more powerful weapons is something introduced because it's an expectation of games of this ilk to provide it. This actually speaks to what I feel is Death Stranding's largest problem, in that it's a game that speaks to careful passage and safe movement, of allowing players to focus on tasks that are often quite chill and relaxed, of gradually building up your game world and all the features within it, either individually or as part of the player community. However, it all too often gets in the way of itself, and robs the game of this more relaxed gameplay. I don't necessarily think this is a fault of the development team, but rather a conflict between the game's core themes and the expectations of a game directed by Hideo Kojima. Some of this is certainly the fault of the director himself, with silly product placements, mechanics like grenades that require the player to go to the toilet to be restocked, yeah, you heard me right, or the fact that when every main character is introduced or a song is played at a key moment, the game has to open up the IMDb page to give you the information. Not to mention the all-important 10-minute cutscenes that interrupt the flow of play that ultimately can be delivered in half the time. It just can't help but stop and remind you that you're playing a Kojima game, rather than simply allow you to enjoy it for what it is. This esoteric nature often comes across as arrogant to me, in that you're interrupting the experience of the game so that your auteur interests are satisfied. I appreciate that, given my opening statement of this video, I'm keen to be able to play a Kojima game without the reminder, given I often find whatever parts of his games that are interesting are usually overcast by the more ridiculous elements he slaps in there, so ultimately, I'm probably not the game's target demographic. But over time, I did come to accept it and was able to move on, in part because I just found the main game itself to be quite satisfying. At the time of writing, I haven't even finished the game, but I've clocked up somewhere in the region of over 50 hours. It's worth noting that I am playing the director's cut version of the game on PlayStation 5, which only has some minor improvements to various aspects, but from what I gather is not a fundamentally different experience. While there are some minor changes to combat and item mechanics, it seems, if anything, the improved resolution and performance on consoles is the big difference. Like I said earlier, the game is wonderful and it's just fun to drink in that game world as you slowly move from one place to the next. In closing, Death Stranding is a game that, provided you're aware of what you're getting into, is ultimately quite satisfying. If you go into this looking for a stealth combat tactical shooter, you'll be left disappointed. If you went into it looking for a walking simulator, you might also find yourself wanting more. It's a little bit of both, a AAA walking simulator for lack of a better definition, given it has to provide the violent accoutrement one would expect of such big budget fare. I'm going to keep plugging away at it. I want to finish it and see where the story goes, as dumb and often ridiculous as it is. But yeah, that's my thoughts. Thanks for watching this episode of Smoke and Mirrors on Death Stranding. Let me know your thoughts on the game if you've tried it out. And of course, if you haven't already, be sure to check out my episode on AI in games, where I talk a lot about how the AI works in the game. And with that, I'll be back soon with another episode. Take care, people. Woo!